state I was in. Instant amnesia, yanked to the end. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some force to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some force to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. Wind blew in, cloud was dispersed, rainbows appearing, the passions were burst. Breezes are singing, they're feeling good. Moment had passed like I knew that it should. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All it's got to take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away. All I got to do is to love you. All I got to be is be happy. All it's got to take is some warmth to make it blow away, blow away, blow away.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session, In This Together, New Momentum for Indo-Pacific and Europe. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of the National Interest. We have a very, very big panel today, and one of these interesting subjects that I wonder if we're on the very front end of this topic for many more years, or whether there's actually more substance and more viscosity in this topic than some of us may have realized in terms of what's happening in the world today. When you look at middle powers, if you want to call them middle powers, but basically how the world is sorting itself out, concerns about China, concerns about Russia, concerns about the United States. Many of the previous lectures have focused a little bit on the increasing erraticism of the United States, the wobbliness of some alliances. We've also seen aspirations of China and Russia and the muscularity that they brought to their agendas has basically changed a lot of the topography of national security priorities for countries and how they have looked at their terrain and where they're looking for help, assistance, partnership, and new ways of looking together. So today, we're sitting here to look at the broad question of that topography and those new priorities as they've come together. We have a fantastic panel here. Let me introduce our panel to you. At my far left, we have Yoon Jong-baek, who is the Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. Glad to have you here with us.
Thank you.
We have Harinder Sekhon, is Distinguished Fellow at, is it Cuts International? Cuts International in Delhi, and she is going to bring in part of the India perspective on these issues. We, of course, have the Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Kęstutis Budrys. Great to have you with us. We have the Foreign Secretary of the Philippines, Maria Teresa Lazaro. And I want to note that this is the first time a Foreign Secretary of the Philippines has been at this conference and spoken here. So this is a new territory here. And we have Ambassador Angus Campbell, who's the Ambassador of Australia to the European Union, NATO, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Big portfolio there. And then we have finally Tara Varma, just to my left, who is Managing Director of Strategic Foresight and Director of the German Marshall Fund's Paris office. As we sort of start this, part of the write-up that this conference gave to this was to look at sort of some of the commentary that President Macron of France had thrown in this, that we have to sort of look at this new topography, that nations have to decide where they are in their strategy not to become vassals of the two great hegemons, as he put it, and what that was going to look like. And I don't know if everyone has vibes with that formula, but I do think there's something going on in the world about whether nations have the capacity to make their own weather when you have giant other players, very, very big players in the world, the United States, China being the two most obvious, but there are others that are creating a lot of weather for others. And that's the whole question of how can nations begin work together so that they have more control over their own destiny. So, Madam Secretary, why don't we start with you? I'd like to ask you just to share with us a little bit about the strategic priorities map of the Philippines and of ASEAN. I've been to ASEAN and the ASEAN region many, many times. I love Southeast Asia. I'm fascinated by the maturing of strategic interests in the region. But why don't you share with us your map? And I also know you're going to also share with us a short statement.
Well, just to say thank you very much for that question. Well, right at this present year, 2026, the Philippines is the ASEAN chair, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And to your question of this, exactly what the title talks about is the new momentum. It is also the view of ASEAN that there should be a good amount of relations, particularly with the EU, with the European Union. In fact, there are so many things that are happening in the sense politically. There are training programs with the US. We have what they call Balikatan, or shoulder to shoulder, whereby there have been, I think, about 17,000 military soldiers that were invited for this big training program, and I think some members of the EU, I think 3 or 4 countries have participated. Then from the economic point of view, there's the ASEAN EU how they say this, FTA, which is being formulated. This is very, very important. You're looking at about almost 700 million in terms of population of ASEAN, and hopefully we'll be able to conclude that at the appropriate time. As far as the Philippines is concerned, we'll be having this Philippine-EU FTA hopefully before the end of July. And of course, on many other aspects, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of ASEAN-EU cooperation. So this is in the direction that it's going. And
But let me ask you, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 was as robust as it could be, between ASEAN and the EU, where is it now? Where do you think it needs to go? Because it's one thing to have a kind of celebration that these things are happening, but are they robust enough?
I think yes. If I will give you a number, I would put it at 8. And there's still a lot of things to do between the two regions. I think the two regions are just probably the two biggest regional organizations, and it's pushing its way forward. In fact, we will be developing a new strategic cooperation. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership that we will be celebrating its 50th anniversary of these two big regional organizations.
What do you think is driving? Is it enthusiasm for Europe, or is it your frustration and fear and aggravation with China? What's the driving force?
It's actually a lot of factors. Not only the economic aspect, but also the political issues. The basic thing for us is the rule of law, based on international law, the multilateralism. These are the concepts which is in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is are all self-restraint, and that there should be a peaceful settlement of disputes, non-interference of internal affairs. These are the very concepts of our Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and we believe that the EU has certain concepts on this, and that's the reason why this enthusiasm, if you may say so.
Foreign Minister Boutros, I'd love to get your take, from the European side of this. Again on the strategic priorities, and looking at this link on whether it's robust enough, where it is, what are the driving overlap, that Venn diagram of security interests between Europe as you see them and the leading democracies in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think there are not one factor or reason, there are a combination of those. And I would start from the very clear geostrategic understanding that there is no comfort zone in this world and in this globe. All areas that are affected by crisis, instability, or the war immediately creates the effects and some outcomes elsewhere. And this is the natural need for us to cooperate. And I think that was the reason why also the security dialogue started before 2022, before the full-scale invasion to Ukraine. After full-scale invasion into Ukraine, we all understood that, okay, we have also to build those alliances and to build those cooperation networks to protect the international law and to stop the aggression as the form of the foreign policy, or as the form of the imposing will on the other countries. And then now with the very recent developments, when we see the decreasing support to international organizations, the decreasing support to multilateralism that is coming from United States, there is now the shared understanding that, okay, we also have to do more together to protect it and to create these stable relations. So I see these as the driving forces, next to, of course, the one that was already there in the beginning of EU and ASEAN cooperation, that is economics, that is the trade. But once again, there is now the new impetus for it. So now seeing and participating in those meetings, like a couple of weeks ago, I was in the ministerial EU-ASEAN meeting in Brunei, and I'm looking forward also to go this July to Manila, to Philippines, and also to join the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. I see this new understanding that, okay, now we have to do this. So meaning that we have to speed up with the trade, and then what the minister just mentioned with the free trade agreements that we finalized with Indonesia, India, now Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, that we are from EU side also pushing forward. That will build for us new opportunities. That is something shared. The other shared piece, that is the respect to international law and order. And I see this and can feel the interest in EU as some source of stability and in respect to its commitments, and also in protection of international law. And of course, we share the concerns. And those shared concerns are not only about
how
the
do you solidify it? And I ask this respectfully because I think we're in a very different inflection point where a lot of patterns of interaction are being tested. But I learned in early political science that when you watch a political system on a sunny day, you really don't know the norms and habits. You have to see it under stress. You have to see things when they're dark. You have to see, what relationships matter. You've been through a tough time with China recently in Lithuania over the naming of a Taipei office. And I'm interested in sort of look at these crisis moments. If there were a crisis, we've just had the U.S. president visit China. First thing out of Xi Jinping's mouth basically was the most important thing in our relationship is Taiwan and its resolution. And by the way, better read Thucydides and remember that story. So, if there were an action, I think this is what how common are the common interests between the Asia Pacific and Europe? If there was a spark, some form of kinetic action, some crisis that involved Taiwan, is Europe going to be there helping the Philippines, helping the Korea, helping Japan and other nations in the region?
We are interlinked. You wouldn't find the wargaming, be it the public one or be it behind the closed doors, that would isolate only one potential theater of the war. That is happening in Europe, but not happening in Indo-Pacific, or vice versa. It is happening some tensions in the Pacific that it hasn't the effect in Europe. It won't be like this. We are interlinked, and we understand that will be the opportunity created immediately for another potential aggressor to use this momentum. And then knowing that for United States, those conditions will be the ones that would create overstretching. So this is natural scenario that we are working out. So this is at strategic level. We are interlinked in the interest to deter together those scenarios and also to preserve the peace and stability. On the peacetime, what we are sharing with each other, interest in building resilience for our societies and for our countries. When Lithuania introduced our Indo-Pacific strategy that we have for a couple of years already and implementing, so we put 3 priorities: security, resilience, and trade. That's what we are looking for. So what concerns resilience, those lessons that we learned from constant attacks from our neighbors in different ways, in hybrid activities, cyber activities, propaganda, you name it, we've seen, political interference, everything. What we learned, we saw that in other directions, when we are talking about the other targets, the methods are the same. So it means that the countermeasures should be also the same. So we share these lessons as the best practice with the others. Same with China's activities against us, what concerns economic coercion, how much they differ from other directions, and we know how to deal with it. And then Lithuania was the successful case how to resist to those measures that were applied against us. So we are ready to share all these expertise. And we know that there are some certain areas in the Pacific where we are learning on our side also. So that is the security, part of the security dialogue, and not only. So when you think about the military scenarios in the case of the war, then you push yourself to think also, okay, what we can do to prevent it and how we can cooperate in the time of peace.
Tara, I would love to bring in France for a moment, as we're also, in a way, what we're talking a lot about is hedging bets against how the world is turning and evolving. And it was about 5 years ago, there's a funny story, I was asked by the French ambassador to the United States to throw a big party. It was around the time of the AUKUS deal. He had been recalled by President Macron, and he wanted a party to come back, with Washington to come back, and to basically show that we all loved France still, and it was all going to be okay. So I needed a name for the party, and I wanted to kind of invite politicians, so I didn't want a Republican, a red party or a blue party. So I asked, what's the middle? And I asked, what's a purple something, a purple rock? And someone said, Amethyst. So I named this party Amethyst. It was an overwhelming success. Turns out that Amethyst was also the name of a French nuclear submarine in the Pacific that I had no idea about. Maureen Dowd of the New York Times wrote an article saying that I was trying to troll the Biden administration and shame it for the AUKUS thing we did this. But I was intrigued that there was a French nuclear submarine in the Pacific, and it kind of raises something I think wasn't wasn't on people's map, then in fact Europe has strategic interests and strategic legs in parts of the world we hadn't thought about. But take us a step further. How consistent is it, and why don't we notice it more? Why is, as we sort of talk about the topic here today, am I not feeling like it's more there than we've seen in the past?
I think it is there, so I'm not going to repeat it. France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. It has a number of territories there. And it's been wanting for Europeans to do a lot more in the Indo-Pacific. The EU came up with a strategy in 2021 on the Indo-Pacific, really working on security and governance and trying to present itself as a predictable actor. There's one element of that strategy, which is the actual paper that came out, and we have a number of European member states who have their own national strategies. And with this pillar comes a financial leg as well, a project called the Global Gateway, whose aim is to mobilize 300 billion euros in the region, coming from the public and private sectors as well. We know that for the EU, its main geopolitical tool is trade, and so the idea for the EU is to leverage the single market as much as possible. Only in 2026, this year, so we're mid-May, the European Union has signed a free trade agreement with Australia and with India, called the mother of all deals by Ursula von der Leyen. There's a willingness, really, you see, by the EU to try and leverage a number of trade instruments, trade agreements, to de-risk its supply chains from China. I think that's absolutely key. And that has been the EU's goal for a long time now. It's trying as well to project itself as a security actor in the region, and it's, I would say, mostly perceived by countries in the region as a good trade actor, a good trade partner, but you can see a number of Indo-Pacific partners struggling to see the EU as a security actor, which we understand. We've discussed since the beginning of the conference yesterday whether the EU is actually a security actor or not, whether the EU is even capable of defending itself in its own neighborhood, and if it's not, why would it even try to defend any other countries in the Indo-Pacific? But I think in the backdrop of an increasingly unpredictable US administration, the idea for the EU is to present itself as a stable, predictable partner. And as European allies of the US with Indo-Pacific allies of the US, we have a lot in common. We have challenges in common, but we do want to work together a lot more. There are a number of industrial norms that we can work on. And what I've presented to you until now is how Europe can be present in the Indo-Pacific, and there are a number of ways in which it can do it.
And so you think that overlap is big?
I think it's pretty big, but the one thing that actually we don't see enough of is how the Indo-Pacific is present in Europe. The way Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea have been providing support to Ukraine because they understand that Ukraine security, European security are actually also key to Indo-Pacific interests, in particular when North Korean soldiers are employed by Russia and actually killed on European soil. There is an interconnection, an interconnectedness that's quite clear there. Right. So we do want to be able to work together to build a scaffolding of these rules that we can all abide by. I think that's the whole point.
Deputy Director General Beck, I want you to give us a kind of bifurcated picture, because it's been staggering to look at the arms shipments and sales from Korea that have gone to Poland, that are going to Ukraine, that the presence is huge, that you're seeing. But I'm also interested in your neighborhood. I'm interested in what's going on, your concerns about North Korea, Russia, and the overlapping security interests. So to Tara's point, maybe you might want to comment about the region's presence in Europe, but I also want to hear about your neighborhood.
Yeah, so are you trying to focus on DPRK deployment of troops, or our relation with Russia and China? I mean, they're related.
Well, I'm interested in your dashboard of threats and how you see that, and how that creates some common cause, if there is there, with our friends from Europe that are here.
Right. Well, basically, we're pursuing. It's very, so natural and very simple. We're pursuing the regional stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. We don't want to become a starting point of a larger conflict. Let me touch upon the DPRK and Russia relation first. We view North Korea-Russia military cooperation as a very serious and direct threat. Security threat. North Korea's deployment of troops to Russia supports the illegal invasion of Ukraine and prolongs the suffering of innocent people in Ukraine. And we must cooperate to stop this. In addition, actually, this is more direct, I think, to us. There's a concern that North Korea could obtain advanced technology, really, modern war experience, and obtain advanced technology and enhancement of its nuclear and missile capability as a quid pro quo for aid to Russia. And what seems clear is that as long as the war in Ukraine continues, their interests very much align. I mean, Russia needs the weapons and troops, and DPRK needs political and technical and economical, support from Russia. So it seems that the cooperation-based, cooperation or collusion-based necessity will continue for a while. However, we don't want to really escalate tension on the Korean Peninsula. We will closely monitor the situation, and we might have to respond accordingly later. But at this point, I guess what we can do is just to strengthen our defense capability based on strong Korea-U.S. alliance, as well as we expand our partnership with. In order to make a really substantive progress with Indo-Pacific countries in Indo-Pacific and Europe, such as the EU, NATO, and IP4, and then trilateral cooperation, ROC, US, Japan. And in this regard, let me just touch upon Russia and China bilateral relation as well. China and Russia are our neighboring countries. I mean, we sometimes say we cannot move away from them. We're just stuck together. And the thing is, they are important, really, players to regional security issues. And we are trying to really manage the relation, so sort of like make it very stable relation. Some people view that, China, Russia, North Korea is a sort of like a one axis to treat. But we don't think that they are exactly the same. For instance, we, for China and Korea relations, we try to, based on our, Korea-U.S. alliance and trilateral cooperation mechanism and other expanded partnership, at the same time, we still try to really develop Korea-China strategic cooperation partnership as well. And in fact, China was our first destination of summit diplomacy scheduled this year. So based on that, we are making our efforts to make China to constructively engage to make some real progress to resolve our, North Korean nuclear issues and establishing peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. For Russia, I have to say, it might sound a bit, awkward, from certain perspective, but still we're trying to make sort of like a stable relation with Russia as well, because we have like our citizens and our businesses in Russia. So we have to, maintain a certain level of diplomacy and, constructive and, productive relations. However, Russia's case is a little bit different,
right?
Because, while we try at least make some efforts to maintain our normal relation with Russia, the most important thing at this point is that we have to keep our, efficient and consistent sanction system against Russia, so that we block its increase in war-fighting capabilities and to raise their cost of war.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question, and we'll get Angus and Brenda in just a moment. But I'm really interested in another dimension of that is, as we talk about foes, sometimes it's the wobbliness of allies that creates a lot of tension. In this conference, the thing that came up yesterday was, on one hand, America may be giving support and aid to its allies in NATO. On the other hand, it may be pulling them back. And as I kind of look at Korea, as you just described, the U.S.-Korean relationship, many leaders in the Baltics, for instance, say they're not going to outsource their security interests to anyone. The partnership's important. But if you see America, and like a lot of people have been talking about the United States in a sort of a phase of strategic contraction, do you fear that that strategic contraction will change the dynamics for the ROK and how it looks at other alliances, other things you need to do to hedge against the perception of American contraction?
I have to say it is a very difficult question. But what I can tell you at this place is that we do not expect substantive or substantial change in our dynamics at this moment. And even if there might be a certain technical change or a certain level of adjustment, I think our basic position is that Korea and US have to very, very closely consult each other. And I think we will make it acceptable mutually. And I'm confident that we have a certain, at least a certain mechanism for dialogue and consultation and cooperation, adjustment, and so forth in place. That, I'm confident.
Thank you. Angus, let me jump to you, Ambassador, on how you see, again, looking at this bridge, and we know about AUKUS, there are many, the critical materials deals, the diplomacy that you yourself are doing in Europe. But can you take us a step further again, looking at this, and then I want to really talk about India as we sort of look at one of the biggest, most consequential rising superpowers of tomorrow and how they see this terrain. But you have to navigate a lot of different waves. Surf a lot of different waves in the Asia Pacific, in Europe, your own relationship with the United States. What's working and what worries you?
I want to start with the recently released Australian National Defence Strategy 2026. We do these every 2 years. In summary, looking at the world from an Australian point of view, it says we're looking at a less predictable, more complicated, more dangerous, less secure world. And I think this conference, throughout the last couple of days, has been reinforcing those judgments. And we then see our security as security within a secure region. You can't be secure in isolation. And we recognise there's an interconnectedness between our own Indo-Pacific region and the Euro-Atlantic. My foreign minister often speaks about how can we enhance the rules, the region in which we live, the relationships we have, and our resilience. And so just a month ago, President von der Leyen visited Australia, and she and Prime Minister Albanese announced the conclusion of negotiations of a free trade agreement, the signing of a security and defence partnership with the EU, and the agreement for Australia to associate with Horizon Europe. Trade, security, research. Quite a comprehensive lift in the relationship between Australia and Europe, while in parallel, Australia has continued quietly and adaptively as time has passed. Since 1953, we have been a partner in different forms with NATO. We have long seen and recognised the value of a relationship with Europe. And that relationship across the community of the Indo-Pacific can span raw materials supply, defence industrial cooperation, a wide range of shared interests that are no longer as geographically specific as they used to be. Foreign interference, the management of strategic narrative, the continuing challenge of counter-terrorism, maritime security across lines of supply, how we resource advanced technologies through critical raw materials, how we recognise the scale of industrial capacity of countries like Korea and Japan and India and harness that amongst a community of nations of common interest. How we can find ways that build on a story of a common desire that nations do not wish to be dominated, nor do we wish nations to dominate. That you end up living in an environment, living in a region where nations have choice about building and creating their future, and they create it together. That's where we want to be, and I think the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific have a lot to contribute to each other. Indo-Pacific is, after all, 60% of the global economy. And if there's any question about that interrelationship, surely the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has reminded everybody, as has the presence of North Korean soldiers fighting in Ukraine. We are interconnected, and those interconnections matter, and they increasingly matter. And certainly Australia wants to be part of the solution.
Ambassador, how is the Trump-Xi Jinping meeting playing among Australians? You know, no big deals come out of it. President Trump saying what a great guy Xi Jinping is. No big clashes that I've yet heard from these. So is that playing well, or does it look like America just folded its hand?
Early days in the kind of analysis we're talking about.
And let me just ask you, if it does turn out that America folded its hand, where does Australia turn?
Thank you. We have a very close, very long, very enduring, and very substantial relationship with the United States, and that is not in question in either direction. Absolutely not in question. And it's a great aspect of our relationship with the world. What I was about to say was, although it's very early in that sort of deep analysis of a summit, isn't it good that they are talking? And I'm reminded, not because we live in any moment of crisis between those two nations, but I am reminded of Churchill's aphorism, jaw is always better than war. And I think a summit that simply engages to build deeper understanding between leaders and between countries is always going to be a good thing.
Harinder, now I want to come to India. And India is hard for me to figure out in this conversation. You know, your size and scale, the rise, your growing population, what you're achieving economically just points to the fact that we're going to need another section of this conference that talks about India as a superpower and the way it is someday. So I think that the Macron framing around vassal and hegemon does a little bit of a disservice in this. But I am interested in how you see what's going on between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. Do you, from your analysis, see India having a foot in that, being an enthusiast for it? Or does it look at Europe as a rival, 500 million people that it wants to take on? Or are you just trying to hedge yourself against all opportunities?
I think we don't peg ourselves as one against the other. And if you notice, India's come a long way. It's matured in its foreign policy choices. India engages with the United States, with Russia, and with EU, all independently and on merit. And, we've come a long way from the Cold War period when we were globally isolated in 1971, when the United States did the Kissinger diplomacy with China, left us out in the cold. We were engaged in a war with Pakistan. And I think we've moved ahead from that period. And where I see ourselves today is, there are challenges in our growth. We don't see ourselves as a hegemon. We are a democracy, and we are proud of the fact that we are a democratic country. But our challenge is turning our youth into, from preventing it from becoming a youth bulge into a youth dividend. And for us, our policy has always aimed towards India's development and growth. We look at technological advancement, and we tried to diversify rather than being dependent only on the United States as being the net provider of our security. When it came to the Quad also, we are the only country which is not a US military ally. Japan and Australia are both military alliance partners of the United States. And India held its own. We became a Quad partner because the US saw some merit in India's core inherent strengths. When it comes to EU, I think we've made rapid strides with France and England. We had a very healthy maritime relationship going back to the end of the Second World War. But more recently, Germany has played a very major role by signing defense agreements with a defense agreement with India, and the EU-India free trade agreement, which was signed earlier this year. I think EU recognizes that there is a merit in India in doing work with India, and India is no longer just an economic entity or an economic market. I think there's a change in how the EU looks at us. And India also would want greater integration into the supply chain mechanism, co-production, co-development, because I think what I mentioned earlier, India's got an aspirational young population, and the Prime Minister's mandate is skilling India, creating meaningful employment for the youth. And I think this fits in because India is no longer a regional balancer. We have, in fact, emerged as a foundational pillar of the Euro-Indo-Pacific bridge. And this is through three major parts to our policy. I'll come back to it later if we have the time. Firstly, we've emerged as a security provider for the littoral states in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
The Prime Minister has been, pegged India as a leader of the global South, which has been well received by countries like Philippines. With Vietnam, we've had a very old relationship. With South Korea, their president was in India just about 10 days back. We have diaspora in the smaller countries in the Pacific region. And I think Act East policy was something which goes back to 1992. It's not something new that India engages with the Indo-Pacific. And also, I think India has, over a period of time, built a lattice work of these smaller, with the minilaterals, we've built up our smaller relationships, both bilateral, trilateral, minilateral, and at the same time, we've got big partnerships like the recent Guam Sea Dragon exercises, which we held more recently. So I think we straddle a bit of both. EU, US, China. China is the biggest neighbor, biggest challenge. But
China's become more of a pal, though, recently, hasn't it?
Yes, because they think that we are old civilizations. I was in China just a week ago.
Did India and the feelings in India really deeply change because of the U.S. tariff hit? And then we saw your Prime Minister, President Xi, talking about something that many geostrategists in this room said would never happen, happening, talking about the depths of relationship and friendship. And I want to go back to what Deputy General Beck said for a minute, is in many of these cases, because I think it's one of the real points of divergence here, there are accommodations and ability to try to stabilize relations with Russia, with China, in some of these complicated countries, if I wasn't mistaking you. But I just want to sort of say the change in topography that I've seen in India is really a much closer relationship with China. In fact, you noted to me that, hey, we ought to have China on this panel.
Well, we are trying to move beyond what happened in Doklam in 2020.
Right.
But I would not say it's only because of what the United States, the tariff war. This started much before that when, maybe a year before the tariffs hit us, because we do realize that, despite everything, India and China, there's a great deal of trade engagement between the two, though it's to the detriment of India, because we have a major trade deficit with China. But at the same time, we need to engage with them because we have a contentious border. And there is a feeling that if there is greater economic synergy, it makes it easier to settle the political question because there is a greater interaction between business communities, between the trade representatives of the two countries. There is a great healthy border mechanism, trade border mechanism between India and China. Our northeastern states carry on a great deal of cross-border trade with China. So it was not just the United States. It is a necessity. China, of course, would like us to, but we've also made it very clear that we need to resolve the border issue, and it cannot be that just this colonial thing we accept, and we need to move ahead. I think there's a little bit of seriousness, but I don't know if the Trump visit to China is going to change their perception. They feel that they had won this round with the United States even before the visit took place.
Well, I'm going to ask the Foreign Secretary about this because you're sitting right over there and you're in constant contests with China, territorial disputes, law of the seas disputes, etc. I mean, you are in the crosshairs of a lot of tensions in the region as you're coming in as the chair of the U.S.-ASEAN, I'm not U.S.-ASEAN, ASEAN. I'd like to chair the U.S.-ASEAN Council, but I think that as you sort of sit in your place, one of the big things that came up with President Trump is this compulsion to push allies of ours to choose between the U.S. and China, to decouple or de-risk, perhaps a better term. But I'm interested in how you see, so India's moved in a different direction and more closely to China. How is it happening in ASEAN? Are you de-risking and decoupling? And what are the lessons you're learning from that?
Well, I first speak about the Philippines. The United States is the only treaty ally of the Philippines since 1952. And as such, we came up with the new Mutual Defense Treaty, which until now is very much in place. However, China has become a robust trade partner, and we cannot deny that. However, we have issues, and you have mentioned it, a dispute in the South China Sea. There are continuous intrusions, has been reported in the international press. However, we have come up with our own mechanism, which we call the Bilateral Consultative Mechanism of the South China Sea. So we are of the view that issues and disputes such as this should only be solved and can be solved through diplomacy and diplomatic dialogue. On the ASEAN setting, it's a different matter because ASEAN, 11 of us now, have different political affiliations. Some are very close to China, some are just balancing things off. And therefore, I think that's how ASEAN is really different. We decide on consensus, and it's been working for us for the past almost 60 years, and there has been no big conflagration in our part of the world. This Treaty of Amity and Cooperation that we've been talking about, which hopefully the Lithuanian foreign minister will be acceding to when he goes to Manila in July, has about almost 67 high contracting parties.
How are the optics of the Trump-Xi meeting playing in Manila?
I'm sorry?
How are the optics of the Trump-Xi meeting playing in Manila?
Well, just as been mentioned, there seemed to be not much of really in-depth information and analysis. However, of course, the discussions concerning Taiwan is, of course, taking a different light in the sense that we are only 70 nautical miles away from Taiwan, which really makes a difference. We have 250,000 Filipinos working in Taiwan, and that makes a lot of a difference in terms of how we are looking at Taiwan. So, well, that's as far as the optics is concerned, but there is concern, of course, on how things will unravel if the situation, I mean, if there has been, the situation really worsens. Our view is we're concerned about our Filipino nationals.
Minister Boutros, I want to ask you a little bit about some of the currency in this relationship and other things. One of the other big topics of this conference has been critical materials. Australia's a giant in the critical materials space. And as you begin looking at the critical materials arena really rose because of the heart attack that many nations had after COVID. They realized, wow, there are a lot of strategic dependencies out there, medical supplies, active pharmaceutical ingredients. It's not just copper, zinc, cobalt, and a lot of critical materials that I can't pronounce easily. But I'm interested in how, as you kind of look at that arena, and it really is a question on how, are there opportunities there between a resource-rich Indo-Pacific region and Europe? I know, for instance, Estonia itself is getting in this game. I know Lithuania in various ways is beginning to move this, of looking at how you might work together to become not independent, but perhaps less dependent on some other players in these areas? And are there other elements of currency to protect your assets or needs from being weaponized against you, as we saw in the energy fronts?
Yeah, and not only in energy fronts, also in some others. So Lithuania was targeted by 3 different countries what concerns economic tools or dependencies. That was Russia, all sort. That was transport in the very beginning of our regained independence, closing down the railways, oil supplies, gas supplies, electricity,
Right.
not. But there were many areas. Same with Belarus and China. And what concerns China, that was the most broad measures that were applied against us. We even modeled, I remember back in the day, different precedents that China used the coercive measures against Australia, against its neighbors, and in all the direction. So Lithuania was the hardest case from all of these. So what we learned from it, you cannot allow to be dependent in the critical area on some actor that would use this for the political purpose as the weapon, your dependency. That is the rule. That is it. So if we are talking about the dual-use technologies, we're talking about something that is really critical for the functioning of your economy, and you cannot diversify it immediately in a matter of months. So you have to deal with it in a peacetime and then find the other alternatives. So this is how it works. So with China, we saw very clearly back in last October, when the export controls were imposed on China's products, what effects it has everywhere, globally. And they did it just for the political purpose. So who can be now secure from these practices being introduced again, and how we will deal with it, talking about those other scenarios that can push us into the really difficult waters. So the solution for it is to cooperate between the countries, among the countries, plurilaterally, the ones that respect the trade rules and the ones that respect each other, and we can rely on them. So where else then EU...
Is there a strength in that deal-making, Mr. Minister, in a way in which you can avoid, I would even say avoid the U.S.? I mean, I think one of the most interesting things in the terrain, the topography of trade today, you just said it, the FTA is coming up a lot between Mercosur and the EU, other countries that are doing on. Can you have the same kind of thing both in energy and critical materials and other fronts, where basically you have new leagues? Because it gets into the Mark Carney question, right? Because Mark Carney in Davos basically said, we need a new set of arrangements. And I think we're all waiting to see what those begin to look like. And will they have strength or legs that matter to the bigger powers, or that at least secure your own interest? So I'm just interested in whether or not you think, I mean, you may want to hedge with these countries, but is that something you're putting on the agenda as part of your ministry's agenda to basically go cut deals out there that may not involve the mega powers?
We won't do it in bilateral way. It's impossible. That's why United States are pushing critical minerals agenda to build the plurilateral system, and the ones where they would cooperate and set the rules and set the fences around the system. Because you cannot do it bilaterally, you cannot do it unilaterally. And in this field, what concerns critical minerals, I'm convinced that we have to cooperate, all of us, including United States. That's why I was present in the ministerial meeting back in February in Washington on this topic, and also was convincing my colleagues, member states of the EU, to do the same with the EU. We have to speed up, we do not have the time. And for our presidency, the first half of 2027, that will be one of the priorities. I will chair the Trade Council, and economic security will be one of the priorities. And it's not only critical minerals. There are so many other elements within it. And in some areas, we have to decouple.
I couldn't support the Minister more. Australia, think of the periodic table of elements, put it over the map of Australia.
They're all there.
All there. But the point is a diversity of supply chains. Not to cut anybody out, but to enable a market system to function. At the moment, in critical raw materials, across a whole wide range of materials, critical to high technology, an open market does not exist because of the overwhelming dominance of one player in that market that can, if there is an interest, shut down supply or control price. And we don't want to be replacing essentially an almost monopoly with another monopoly. We think that we should be Australia should be part of a community of nations that give assurance to the critical materials for advanced technologies for all through market mechanisms, but to move from where we are to where we need to be, that will need everybody, and it will be difficult, but at the end of it, a market system will operate.
Let me ask Deputy Director General Beck, I'm really also interested in the tech questions that are out there. We've had a lot of talk at Leonard Mary about AI, the coming wave of technology. And as I mentioned earlier, Korea has sold a massive, done a massive defense deal with Poland. And you're a manufacturing and technological superpower, in my view. And I'm interested in whether or not there are opportunities as we look at some of the European positions on AI, regulation, on technological development. Is this an area of discussion that would be robust in terms of in this together between, as you see it, that may not dismantle your close partnership with the United States, but would diversify your options?
Of course. As I said earlier, clearly the most important relationship for Korea is Korea-US alliance, obviously. However, at the same time, we're realizing that what we need to do to really strengthen our defense capabilities, we need to expand our, not just making another treaty or arrangement. We're just really trying to make a substantive and substantial progress with our partners. And I think although it is a certain form of crisis, but I think it brought to us another chance and opportunities. We see this relationship with EU and NATO getting closer as one actually good chance to really expand our cooperation on the area you just mentioned, like AI and cyber and other, of course, industrial, the defense industrial cooperation. And etc. So we, I don't need to really lay out all the details here, but through NATO, we are very much interested in, doing cooperative work in emerging technology area. And I think, in fact, in some of the areas, we're making quite good progress. So, definitely, yes, we are very much interested in doing that.
I want to get Charles' take on France, and I want to begin moving to the audience in just a moment. But I'm also interested in what you talked about. I was very taken with what you said about Ukraine and the connections that you automatically see in ways many between the DPRK, Russia, supplying weapons and being engaged in troops in Ukraine. That this is personal for you. Do many South Koreans feel that connection to that crisis in an emotional and a psychological way? Because this is a deeper thing about this topic of in this together. There's a sterile way to talk about it, and then there's the pace where the human connection and the concern for each other is deeper. And so I'm trying to say, I was taken by that. I felt that deep concern. Do regular Koreans feel that being engaged in Europe is vital for them?
Well, I think for many Koreans, it's equally, I think, a new experience and new findings that they realize that the security environment in Europe and Indo-Pacific region is really getting more and more. But even at the current point, it's very interconnected, and the fact that DPRK troops are in Ukraine territory, in Ukraine war battlefield, it's just really alarming to most of the Korean people. And, I don't remember any survey outcome of asking Korean people about, how do you feel about North Korean troops in Ukraine war? But I remember there was, debate about this. I think it's one of the presidential debate before our presidential election. I think, and that was around right after the Russia's illegal aggression of Ukraine war, and whether we should help Ukraine or we should sort of like distance. We need to distance because it's I mean, we don't have a lot of room for going out there and just helping out other people's war because we're faced with just a really existential threat from DPRK. They are just blatantly insisting that we're two hostile states and we're the real primary enemy, and then they are going to thoroughly ignore and exclude us, and they just don't hide it. I mean, there's no diplomacy or whatsoever in there. So we are every day facing with those challenges, and we ask ourselves that if we're not helping Ukraine when we are in difficult times, who will help us? We think about that all the time. And the thing is, as I said earlier, we are trying to stabilize with our neighbors just to establish the peace on the Korean Peninsula. I mean, I do not intend to lay all the details in here, but it's obvious and it's easy to see how politically tricky and sensitive situation the Korean Peninsula is situated. We're surrounded by China, Russia, and then it's been decades that we send our businesses, and then we have factories in China and Russia, and we have airlines in direct flights. It's just dozens of them, and so it's not easy really just to cut. Even if we feel really sympathetic and we feel like a really a lot for Ukraine.
And just get quick snapshots from Harinder and Tara. The Foreign Secretary said that she sees the decibel level of interest on a scale of 1 to 10 between the Indo-Pacific and Europe at around an 8. I would probably put it a little lower, but I'll respect your number. But I'm interested in if this is real, do we need more institutional development? Do we need more do you need to build an infrastructure? ASEAN was an infrastructure that brought a lot of countries together. NATO was an infrastructure. Do you need a more regular dialogue? Are there pieces of this conversation that are kind of rah-rah because there's not the institutional regularity of contact, or is it there and need to be strengthened and built more robustly? Tara?
So there is a regularity of contact. There's the EU Indo-Pacific dialogue that's been happening annually for the past 4 years, where a number of issues are discussed, and very concrete ones. I mean, what the EU wants to do is to achieve its green and digital transition. For that, it needs critical raw materials. We've discussed this already. It signed agreements with Australia, with Indonesia, because it needs these critical raw materials for rare earths, for batteries, and for semiconductors. One, I think, issue where Europe and the Indo-Pacific also get along is that they share an affection and interest for multilateral forums. So you see now the EU, for the first time, being a financial contributor to the Indian Ocean Rim Association, to the Pacific Islands Forum. There is a real interest in contributing to the discussion. I just wanted to add one point on India-China relations, because I don't want to give the impression that things are going so well. For the Indian strategic community writ large, China is the major challenge. It's the main threat to India. There is absolutely a trade deficit, and there is a willingness to continue trading with China because all middle powers are trying to diversify. But I should say, when you look at the Galvan attacks in 2020, the fact that India in 2020 again was the first country to ban Chinese social media platform TikTok, you can understand that, and it did so against the will of its young population. There is a clear sense in India that China is going to be a big challenge. US-India relations have developed for the past 30 years, but one of the key reasons of the rapprochement was there was a shared assessment of China's trajectory. So that is really important.
Harinder?
I think Tara summed it up. China is our biggest strategic challenge and the second largest trading partner. But we have to balance this, and we have to live with it. And we have to engage with them. When it comes to the United States, there is no strategic divergence as such, but trade is a tricky situation with the United States, though we have, in principle, agreed to the US-India free trade agreement, but it has not been rationalized, it has not been accepted, because we are, like India, there's a bottom line which we cannot go back on, and that is our agriculture and dairy sector. We cannot open it up to US competition. So there are challenges, but having said that, I think the sheer size, we keep talking about it, that we don't want to be treated, seen only from the point of view as a market. We are the one of the fastest growing economies. Though we have a weak rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, which has made our development parameters take a bit of a hit. But we know that the sheer size of our population and our market gives us that inherent strength. But we want to, peg it more towards technological advancement in AI and all. We've made rapid moves, and I think that is where we would like to see the progress.
Well, I'm going to thank you. We're going to move to the audience, but I really appreciate everybody. I think we all have a much better feel of the ecosystem of connection, of interests where they overlap, of divergence. I think we can have a whole nother session simulating, what if America went this direction, or you had another kinetic conflict around Taiwan, or a kinetic conflict around Taiwan, or other big shocks we're entering into a period of shocks. And so I think that's one of the big drivers, in fact, of this together, beginning to look at other powers, finding each other to solve this. So why don't we go to the audience here? Let's go to Akita-san in the middle, and right here, Peter, and right here. We'll just gather some questions, and then we'll hit all four corners here real quick. Yes, sir, real quick.
Thanks very much. My name is Ian Story. I'm from the ICS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. My question is to Secretary Lazaro. A month from tomorrow, ASEAN and Russia will hold a commemorative summit in Kazan. You mentioned, of course, that Philippines is chair of ASEAN this year. Will President Marcos travel to Kazan, Russia, to attend that summit, bearing in mind that he's been very critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And secondly, you mentioned several times the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine violated all of those principles contained in that treaty, which Russia endorsed in 2004.
Right.
Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, etc. So what are you going to commemorate at this
Got it.
moment?
Akita-san.
Thank you very much, Hiro Akita, Nikkei from Tokyo. So my question is about potential big shock. So as you discussed, there is a emerging linkage, emerging connectivities linking war in Europe, or war in Ukraine, and a crisis in Asia, because China, North Korea, and Russia, North Korea, and Russia, and China, Russia are collaborating militarily much faster than us. So my question is, what is the worst case scenario you have to worry? What is the kind of risk of a simultaneous wars because of this emerging linkage? How do you assess that? Thank you.
Terrific. Right here, this gentleman here, and there was a fourth I had taken. Oh yeah, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Excellent panel. I think we need more such discussions on distant regions, so it really enlightens us here. But my question goes to Minister Budrys, and by the way, my name is Mar Sanjans. I come from Center for Geopolitical Studies, Riga. Taiwan, China, Lithuania, so we know about the issue. Moderator raised this. What is the current status quo, and where Lithuania is heading to? Which direction, or try to hedge one side or other? Thank you.
Can I just, so I can hear the current status quo on?
Taiwan.
Oh, Taiwan.
China and Lithuania. So
Thank you.
The 2021 dispute and
yes, Peter.
Peter Semleby from the Swedish Foreign Ministry. I'm doing mostly Korean affairs as Swedish Special Envoy for the Korean Peninsula. at the moment. If there had been a Chinese representative on this panel, I would have asked him or her how China sees addressing the North Korean nuclear issue in the midterm and long term. But since there is no Chinese representative, I will address the question to the Korean representative instead, asking her to what extent you expect China to be a constructive actor on this issue. There is a consensus since a long time ago about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula laid down in Security Council resolutions and agreements of various kinds, but it's 30 years ago and the situation looks different. North Korea has 50 or 60 nuclear warheads and delivery vehicles. The Chinese are not talking very loudly about denuclearization anymore after Russia has abandoned this objective altogether. It's probably because China doesn't want to be sidelined in North Korea by Russia. Donald Trump also is talking about North Korea as a big nuclear power. So where does all this leave us? How do you see this issue?
Well, look, and I hope someday, Peter, and I hope you're in the middle of it, we have a discussion about what nuclear politics look like. You know, when you see, in terms of the forfeiture of nuclear weapons, as we saw in Ukraine or Libya or others, how do you get the incentives right to get to a less nuclearized world when, in fact, all the incentives are leading to greater proliferation? But I mean, that's a great question. We had you were jumping out of your chair, so. I'm worried about you. So.
Hi, thank you. It was just hard to make myself seen.
That's great.
There. Minna Olander, Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, and actually it's exactly on the same topic.
Right.
I wanted to address my question to the Deputy Director General Beck about South Korea's quite extensive military trade with Poland, for example, and whether you're following the fairly interesting debate about potential nuclear weapons future for Poland and whether like this kind of eccentric discussions that we have in Europe
right.
is registered, and also the same to the Australian ambassador, whether there's any debate on nuclear issues in Australia.
Great, thank you. So when we take a snapshot here, I've kept track, and you're all welcome to ask this, but the question is about ASEAN, the ASEAN-Russian summit in a month. Your thoughts, Foreign Secretary?
To that question about the ASEAN-Russia summit, which will be held in Kazan next month. If you recall, the process in ASEAN is always by consensus. When the decision was made that there will be such a commemorative summit with Russia, that was a decision by consensus, and therefore Philippines as chair is compelled to co-chair this particular meeting. As I said, and I mentioned a while ago, that just like China, the 11 countries, we're now 11, have different affiliations. In the same way, the affiliations with Russia varies from one ASEAN country to the other. But let me be very, and let me confirm that in terms of this issue, Russia, Ukraine, it is only the Philippines who has consistently voted against Russia and in favor of Ukraine. In how many resolutions was there in the UNGA? But it is a different situation with the ASEAN.
Thank you.
Position.
Minister Budrys, and invite many of the others to kind of jump in on this question that Akhtasan raised on the increasing connectivity between kinetic wars out there, participants in them. Sometimes they're federations of participants that we mentioned with the DPRK actually has been deployed in Russia in the Ukraine war. But also worries, I'm going to just piggyback on this, the green lights that are given or appear to be given about how if the United States begins making a play for Greenland, what does that put in the mind of China with this? So I think what is the connectivity of war and crisis today and big shock. So as you look at it, what's your worst case scenario? What do you think we really, really have to solve and avoid in this time. And I just want to it's not humorous, but I mean, it was humorous when I was in Davos and saw a lot of the Trump administration officials whom I know, and they said, Steve, take us out for a good time. If not, we're going to go hold signs on the promenade. We want Greenland. For them, it was a joke. For folks in Europe, it was definitely not a joke, what was going on. And of course, the date just before the World Economic Forum was the date that Donald Trump had threatened to sanction allies of ours in NATO that were supporting Denmark and Greenland. So I'm just interested in your worst case scenarios. Tell us what your nightmares are.
These situations that happen among allies, we can solve it in the allied spirit, as it was with Greenland. So we found the solution. Now we are concentrating on High North, on Arctic security, and we are open also as Lithuania, be part of it, putting our resources, and you need a scientific, militarily, and some economic installations, and then further elements. And then we dealt with it, and we made it. And this is not the worst case scenario that can happen among the allies. The worst case scenario is when our deterrence fails. This is the worst case. And if it fails in one region, what we are talking Indo-Pacific, if for one reason or another, it will immediately be shaken elsewhere. Because in both regions, U.S. is playing a huge role in deterring the potential aggressors with its capabilities, with its allied agreements. And be it Europe or be it Indo-Pacific. So that's what we should be afraid of, and that's why we should interconnectedly build the stability and build the deterrence. And deterrence is the capabilities, this is the commitment, and this is belief of your potential enemy that the allies will come, and that will be implemented as it is on the paper. So each time when we have the questioning and we have the situation when we do not, lack of trust or just exposed lack of trust to each other, it invites the other side to test it. Maybe this is the right time.
Yoon Jeong, what's your nightmare?
Well, first, I want to answer the China-related question.
Okay.
Well, you know what? Before that, I have to comment. I'm just. I was thinking that I'm the first representative from Korean government because only our scholars in private sectors have joined this conference. And I just realized why our colleagues have not participated in this conference, because the questions make them very uncomfortable. So I guess...
I'm sorry, but they're asked with a smile.
Yeah, it doesn't help. So anyway, the China question, I do not have, and I cannot give you the details of how China can do it. But the thing is, the basic sort of like a frame is this. It's not like we understand. We know China is very, very important to DPRK. And what China wants is really a stable Korean peninsula. Because the last thing China wants to see is U.S. military forces in Korean Peninsula, because we are, like neighboring countries. We have a border in common, right? So to avoid, like it's a reverse engineering to avoid U.S. forces in Korean Peninsula, on Korean Peninsula, China will do something so that, not proactively, but we believe that China does not want war breakout, in Korean Peninsula. And the thing is, China keeps saying to us, DPRK does not listen to me, anymore. And then it's not the DPRK that we used to know. We know that, DPRK is a little bit different. However, we are still aware that China is the most important country to DPRK. It's sort of like a lifeline. Even if DPRK has money, cryptocurrency they stole, but what if they have just money? They cannot eat the cryptocurrency money, right? They have to buy something, they have the physical stuff, and then they get it from China. So China is the lifeline. And I think China can, if they have to, might just use it because they want stable peninsula. That's my, it's not really official position from Korean government, but that's one thing we say we know. Yeah.
We appreciate you. So we're right near the end. So I'm going to ask for 30-second nightmares. Harinder?
I think we've had a great debate, and all I would like to say is that I think India offers, in the Indo-Pacific, India provides a stabilizing middle ground between China and the smaller littoral countries. Right. And it also takes a stand against the United States, though for us, the United States still continues to remain the most important relationship.
Thank you. Ambassador?
I want to flip it around. What I'm hoping the great powers are learning from...
Do you see evidence?
Well, yeah. What I see in Ukraine tells me wars are easy to start and hard to finish. Wars metastasize in ways you have no imagining of before they start. Wars are bloodier, and wars are harder to organise, logistically sustain, and wars destroy your economy as fast as you're attempting to destroy your enemy. If that learning is permeating across our international system, well, perhaps the future might not be as dire as your question proposes. And to the young lady, no, Australia is not in any way at all whatsoever considering nuclear weapons.
There we go. Tara, 30-second nightmare.
I think it's partly what we're going through right now. If a military hegemon...
We're in the nightmare.
I mean, if the military hegemon of the world is burning through its weapon stockpile that it needs for itself and for its allies in a war of its choosing that it cannot manage to stop, I think, it's the beginning of a nightmare.
I just want to thank all of you. What a thoughtful discussion. Really, really appreciate all of you listening to one another, sharing. I think this is part of what In This Together was about. So big round of applause for Tara Varma, Angus Campbell, Ambassador Angus Campbell, Foreign Secretary Maria Teresa Lazaro, Foreign Secretary Kasutis Budrys, and we have Harinder Sekhon, our friend from India, and Yoon Jung Baek, who I hope continues to come back despite the tough questions and participate, of course, from Korea. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thanks for your great question. I didn't know that.
I want to be a partner, can't you see? The music is just starting, night is calling, and I